Hello and welcome. My name is Rita Noreka, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of Orkney Japan Association, Skaill House, and the Peer Art Center. Our talk today, Surveying Meiji Japan, Henry Scharbau and the Skaill House Journals, is the result of several years of collaborative effort to find out more about these remarkable journals and to tell their story. Before we get started, the housekeeping. This talk is being recorded. If you have any questions for either of the speakers, please put them into the chat box and we will answer as many as we can at the end. Now, the speakers. Joe Earle was director of Japan Society Gallery in New York until 2012 and has held leadership positions in Asian art departments at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Over the past 40 years, he has curated, organized, or written catalogs for numerous exhibitions of contemporary Japanese art, craft, and design. Far too many to mention here, but these are a few I still remember vividly. Japan's Style in London in 1980, Visions of Japan, also in London, 1991, Serizawa, Master of Japanese Textile Design, New York, 2009, and Bye Bye Kitty, Between Heaven and Hell in Contemporary Japanese Art, New York in 2011. He's now based in London and has recently completed a catalog of 323 works of bamboo art in the Niege collection and a translation of The Soul of Gold by the living national treasure metalworker Osumi Yukie. Colin Houston, our second speaker, has worked in tourism in Scotland for over 37 years. He is currently an international tourism consultant and co-founder of Aurora Spirit Distillery, located in Arctic Norway. Colin has a keen interest in genealogy, one particular fascination being his great-grandfather, Colin Alexander McVean. McVean was one of the first civil engineers from Scotland at the time of the Meiji Restoration and spent 8 years in Japan. When Colin's aunt died in 1998, he discovered boxes of diaries, papers, and also a unique photo album from that time. And he has been working to transcribe and digitize this material. To date, some 14,000 documents and letters, together with 140 photographs, have been scanned and made available. And without further ado, let me hand you on.
Thank you very much, Ruta, and a very quick word of thanks to everyone who's made us so welcome here in Orkney. Malcolm and Sarah, Cormac and his brilliant friendly team at Skaill House, the PR Art Center, and of course the Orkney Japan Association. So the Skaill House journals, there are their titles in English and Japanese up there. And without more ado, I'll set a little bit of, try to establish a little bit of background. Starting around February 1872, Colin McVean, the Scottish director of the Survey Office of the Japanese government, of whom we'll hear more from his great-grandson in a while, had decided to devote his team's efforts to training Japanese surveyors in the art of triangulation, which very simply put, is the process of determining the location of a point by measuring angles to it from known points at either end of a fixed baseline. And that's as far as I'm going to go with the art of triangulation. In March 1873, having completed some of that initial training, McVean set off on a very long trip home to Britain with the twin aims of procuring new surveying equipment and recruiting his friend Henry Scharbau, best known here in Orkney as grandfather of Colonel Scarth, the 11th Laird of Breckness and the last Laird to live at Skaill House. German-born Scharbau was a talented hydrographer and surveyor who had worked in the Hebrides and some of the Western Lochs between 1858 and 1864. And he'd even also, in 1868, drawn a map of the coast of Japan, probably based on a Royal Navy survey, long before he ever went there. But now we must put McVean and Scharbau on hold and hurry back to Japan, where, during McVean's absence, on the 2nd of May, a number of his former trainees gathered in Yokohama in preparation for a lengthy survey of the Kisogawa River system near Yokkaichi in Mie Prefecture, a large town to the southwest of Nagoya, which you can see here over on the left-hand side of the map. Unfortunately, the technology doesn't allow me to use a pointer, but that's where it is, quite a distance away from Tokyo. And I think it's very likely that this talented group were now putting their surveying skills at the service of a remarkable Dutchman, Cornelis Johannes van Doorn, who'd come to Japan in 1872, and just like McVean, was hired as a specialist advisor to the Japanese government, starting work in May of that year, 72, by carrying out an initial survey of the Tone and Edo rivers near Tokyo, and later from July, the Yodogawa and Kisogawa rivers, that's the important part. And he will be joined in September 1873 by another Dutchman, civil engineer George Arnold Escher, who we can actually connect subsequently with a member of this Kisogawa survey expedition. The long Kisogawa expedition, which lasted all the way until January of the following year, 1874, is described in the first of the Skaill House journals. I was lucky enough to handle them for the very first time yesterday morning, having previously studied them from excellent photographs prepared by Skaill House. Measuring, like all the books, about 13 by 19 centimeters, in the present case in 2 volumes, it's in the traditional format for many early modern Japanese manuscripts, with each page a folded sheet with the fold at the outer edge. And the Kisogawa journal comprises some 60 spreads, all of them with lively illustrations, many of them inscribed, and some of them dated, not with the year, maddeningly, but at least with the month and day. Now, one of the very first lucky discoveries I made in my research on the Skaill journals, hampered by the inaccessibility of libraries in London or even in Japan or even in London due to the pandemic, was that a parallel account of this ambitious journey not only survives in historical archives of Numazu, but even better, it was transcribed in its entirety and put online in 2016. So this project is all of this project has been researched entirely online without access to a single hard copy document. This alternative version of the journey was kept by a remarkable man called Okawa Michihisa, at this point aged only 25. And it's a very dry, factual daily log of surveying work, starting on the 15th of April, 1873, and concluding on the 13th of October. Although, as we know from the Skaill journal, as we'll see, the expedition went on, perhaps somewhat informally, for another 3 months, with us not only able to pin down the date of the illustrated Skaill account, but also know the names of some or all of the expedition members who are given here. I'm not going to go through them, that would be redundant. Although it's usually difficult to identify individuals in the journal's illustrations, we can be pretty sure that all or most of them appear in this first page, where perhaps somewhat artificially, they're depicted prior to embarkation on the bluff overlooking the harbor of Yokohama, which had grown over the previous decade from a small fishing village to a principal center of trade between Japan and the rest of the world. The group's a little bit generic, but I venture to suggest that the gesturing figure you see there with his right arm out is Okawa Michihisa himself, author of the official record. And I'm certain that the somewhat stooped, balding figure who stands dressed in black, who stands somewhat away from the others with one person standing next to him, this is a gentleman by the name of Shinohara Masayoshi, of whom we'll hear more later. Now, Okawa Michihisa is really an important figure in this story, and he's a grand example of the trajectory from traditional military caste to reforming technocratic elite, a path that was followed by many young men of samurai origin during the turbulent transition from the Edo period, ending in 1867 to 8, when Japan was ruled by the shogun at the apex of the samurai system and his numerous vassal lords or daimyo from that time to the Meiji era, when the emperor was moved from Kyoto to Tokyo and installed as the head of modernizing, globalizing semi-constitutional government, at the head of virtually the only Asian country to avoid wholesale Western colonization, it's worth mentioning. Orkney was born in 1847, the son of a supervisor of the shogunal falconry grounds. You can't get more upper-class samurai than that, really. And he trained in the same profession. In 1869, he enrolled in the Numazu clan's military academy, where he was an outstanding student. And in March 1873, just 2 months before this first picture was made, we think, he'd entered the Ministry of Finance's Office for Public Works, and was later, as we'll see, involved in a grand trigonometrical survey of 8 former provinces of the Kanto region, including the area between Tokyo and Nasuno. We'll return briefly to the rest of his career and his place in Meiji history, but his success in apparently being appointed at age 26 to lead and document this Japanese-only scientific project with no direct involvement by so-called oyatoi, as the government hired Western experts were called, suggests a young man of unusual application and ability, like so many of the great founders of modern Japan. And it's worth saying that another member of this group, as I mentioned a minute ago, can be linked closely to the Dutch engineer George Arnold Escher, who was in Japan at this time and is maybe better known to many of you as the father of the world famous illusionist graphic artist M.C. Escher. And Yamase was also a fellow student of Orkney. They'd both been to the same college. Of the others, not all of whom are even mentioned here in the Kisogawa Journal, we know little except for Shinohara, who we'll come to later. And no one apart from Orkney and Shinohara seems to have taken part in the 2 other expeditions chronicled in the Skaill House treasures. Now, for reasons that will be apparent later, I want to focus this evening on the last of the journals, so I'm only going to show a few spreads from the Kisogawa Journal and the related Arakawa Journal, written in the following year. There's a wealth of fascinating detail here, not just about the practice of scientific survey work, but much more about the sights, the inns, the food, and the entertainments of this watery, dangerous region, often prone to flood with its many rivers. And to document these in full, especially the exact route of our intrepid band followed through this part of the country, would involve a major research undertaking requiring extensive work in Japan. That's for the future. But of specific importance, by the way, in the present spread, slightly nerdy importance, if you like, is the expedition's official equipment crate, seen on the right of the left-hand page. If you see that box with a handle and writing on it. This is labeled Construction Department of the Treasury. And this construction department had been so renamed in 1871 and would remain part of the Treasury only until October 1874, when it was transferred to the Home Ministry, information that confirms and tallies our 1873 date for the journal. The crate is depicted frequently throughout the Kisogawa Journal, always carefully labeled, as if to remind us of the official nature of the expedition. But more interesting than this technical documentary detail is the 180-degree contrast between the dry official account that Orkawa wrote and the sheer evident fun that he, I think it's he doing the painting, that's a point we'll return to, the sheer fun that our group have, and the fun that I think they didn't really want their government bosses to know about. Their boundless fascination with historic sites, folklore, and traditional industries. For them, in these quite remote places they hadn't visited before. An example here on the right, nothing to do with the goal of the expedition at all, is the Bangkok pottery kilns, which is then on the brink of a major expansion and production. And the little inscription there says, who'd have known how many processes it takes to make a single vessel? So we have this curious crowd traveling through a dangerous and unusual part of Japan. And it's noteworthy, I think, that these diaries are very much about the group's joint activities, their consciousness of going on an adventure together, underlined here by an early instance of the beloved Kinen Shashin, the commemorative photo, that uniquely Japanese harbinger of today's selfie. And this was very much an adventure, as you would never tell from the official account. All the official account has to say on this incident, as you can see from the slide, clear in the morning, rain later, thunderstorms, rain and hail from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. Nowhere is it suggested that some members of the party were actually at risk of drowning. That's too dangerous to report. Or here, for example, in a sketch which appears curiously unfinished, uncolored, they're enjoying the Tsushima Boat Festival, an exuberant celebration that still takes place every July on the Tenno River. And this, of course, is not mentioned at all in Okawa's official report. As I said, we struggle to match individuals to faces in the relatively sketchy style of representation seen here. But here at least two of the party, our college friends, Okawa and Yabase, are separated off. I would guess Okawa here depicts himself as the senior figure. And for future reference, please take note of the pith helmets, emblems of Western imperialism enthusiastically adopted by some of the group. Fortunately, on this occasion, we even know from the official written account why these two have peeled off, and it sort of underlines their elite status. On the 10th of August, Yabase and Okawa went to Fukakusa on the Hato coast to do survey work, while the others stayed home preparing the maps. Although I ought to say that Okawa otherwise seems to be the individual most often assigned map duty in his own official record, and maybe that's a testament to his artistic skills. Now, as the Kisokawa journey rambles on through and beyond its official closing date, and is no longer being reported officially, one has an increasing sense that there's extra time to turn away from surveying and have fun, indulging in quite elaborate landscape sketches like these that don't have anything to do with map making. And the ambitious autumn waterfall here is the only vertical composition in all of the albums. We have to ask ourselves whether the author was a professional artist. The speculative suggestion has been made in Japan that the individual or individuals who painted the albums should be linked to the prestigious Kano Academy or the circle of the controversial and highly versatile painter Kawanabe Kyosai, but there's absolutely no evidence for this. There's no doubting the skill of the artist, or maybe artists, or their absorption of some time-honored techniques of East Asian brush painting. And we should keep in mind, of course, that brush calligraphy and by extension brush painting would have been part of our elite group's core education, plus the fact that a high level of amateur painting skill might have advanced their surveying and map-making careers. But I don't think, for example, we're ever going to discover suddenly that these are deliberately anonymous works by an artist whose signed paintings are otherwise and separately known and famous. And there are, I have to say, a few self-inflicted minor disasters in the course of this first journal. Here, the three younger men on the right sit down to eat a meal of beef stew. I'm sure the beef is not nearly as good as Orkney beef. But Master Sekisen, the Red Immortal, which is another name applied to the older gentleman, the balding Mr. Shinohara, seen here in the foreground on the right, does not eat the meat. Chinese readers among you, if you have time to look very closely at the inscription, can study the inscription on the left. I will spare you a full translation of what follows on the left-hand page. And maybe it's enough to say that this is the privy attached to the restaurant, where one of the party has to make frequent visits. This Rabelaisian episode takes us a very long way from the official surveying report that Okawa had recently filed. And we find that he's still suffering, days later, his head under the quilt, much to the disgust of his traveling companions who hold their noses. The official account of this expedition ends on the 13th of October. But our party remains in the field for 3 months, with only intermittent incidents recorded in the journal. It suddenly gets quite patchy, eventually taking ship again on the 12th of January from the port of Yokkaichi in a steamship, Yokkaichi, that's near Nagoya, named the Seimyo Maru, of which, by the way, an 1873 photograph survives, and it looks exactly like the ship, providing us with some corroboration. And they make it about 60 kilometers to Toba, and then to Shimoda, and which Shimoda that is, whether it's the one that's near Nagoya or whether it's the one on the Eastern Peninsula, it's one of the many mysteries that remain to be solved regarding this long journey. And anyway, they eventually return to Tokyo and Yokohama via this route. So now we get to the second journal, which is shorter. It has only 40 spreads. This time it documents a less ambitious expedition up the Arakawa River, therefore starting more or less in the heart of Tokyo, lasting from March until June, and taking the party at least as far as Kawagoe in present-day Saitama Prefecture, a journey of no more than about 20 or 25 miles. Although it has to be said, there are but few place names to help us trace their route in full. It was thrilling to discover, as I did only last week, that the two red seals here at lower right, under the inscription, read Unsho and Yoshimasa. In other words, we know from the seals that the inscription above is written by this Shinohara, the older gentleman, often depicted as somewhat detached from the main group, who we last saw prudently abstaining from bad food. Perhaps then, and this is something for future research, another thing for future research, we can assign many of the text to his hand, or at least perhaps the more cursive, less deliberately brushed ones. Even on this page, the little poetic Chinese line to the left, "Others cannot know the sorrow of parting," might not be by Shinohara, who, by the way, seems to have got the month wrong in the inscription above his seal, since the 1st of April is mentioned several pages later on. So there is often a sense of haste and improvisation about these drawings and some of these inscriptions. Until we find an independent account of this Arakawa expedition, and there is a mass of material relating to Okawa in the Numazu archive, which remains yet to be explored, we can only speculate as to the names of the personnel. But my guess would be that here Shinohara is the figure with the umbrella in the foreground, his few remaining hairs visible beneath his hat. Kimura, who is mentioned in the inscription, Mr. Kimura's family see him off from his front gate, I think is the figure at left, who is still in Japanese costume. And the third figure, already dressed up as a Western surveyor, is our friend Okawa Michihisa. He's not mentioned by name anywhere in the Arakawa volume, but considering his documented leadership of the 1st and 3rd expeditions, as well as the fact that he and Shinohara are the only individuals to feature in both, it seems reasonable to guess that he's here as well. Without an independent account, as we had for Kisagawa, there's no way we can be sure whether this expedition took place in 1874 or 5. Once again, only months are given, so often in documents of this era. But 1874 seems much more likely, since this is a river survey, likely carried out to assist Dutch-led river improvement projects. And Dutch experts had already surveyed sections of related parts of the unpredictable, unstable, dangerous Tonikawa and Edogawa river system to the northwest of the capital, in which the Arakawa is another component. So I feel more and more confident that this is 1874. And in addition, both this journal and the one we saw before have identically patterned bindings and formats, and they're both illustrated and captioned in a similar style, suggesting that they were planned at the same time and executed in sequence. At this point, by the way, Colin McVean is still far away, not to return until the 5th of May, 1874. And it's another month before Scharbau's ship reaches Yokohama. So I just need to go back one. I apologize that the dates have got a little bit mixed up here, both by me and the authors, but anyway, the one on the left is dated the not to worry. But the picture on the left in this spread is dated the 1st of April, accurately this time, I think. And the 3 pith-helmeted characters are likely to be Kimura, Okawa, and one other, while Shinohara, standing to the left, his hand stretched out in gesture, seems to be one doing the instructing or explaining, as if he's been here before. And here we have a very sympathetic, and this is the sleeping figure is of less importance from earlier on, but here we have a sympathetic image of this Mr. Shinohara. On the left, a faithful likeness. It's called a shashin. That's the contemporary Japanese word for a photograph. And it's the rear view of the head of Master Shinohara Unsho, the woodcutter in the clouds. That's his elegant, artistic, alternate name that we already saw in the seals at the beginning of the volume. And the seal reads Kimura, presumably the same person as the man taking leave of his family on page 1. So we begin to get a sense of the kind of group dynamics. So this elderly gentleman is the one depicted, observed, depicted, and deferred to, I think, somewhat by the others. Toward the end of the Arakawa journal, both place names and dates peter out. And the improbable suggestion is made here that on their travels, the party passed close to Mount Fuji, which they didn't. And it's depicted in this blatant, conflated copy of some of Katsushika Hokusai's famous and distinctive 36 views of the peak with the dramatically placed foreground pine tree. This had been published 4 decades earlier, but was still immensely popular and often reprinted at the time of the journal. but it has nothing to do with the actual journey. So that takes us to the end of our glance through the river journals. But before we move on to the final Nasuma journal, I'd like to briefly try and situate the Skaill treasures within the recent history of travel books and travelogues in Japan. As a literary form, the travel narrative has an immensely long history in Japan. Much too long for us to go into here, but it's likely that some of you have heard of the diary, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, by 17th century haiku poet Matsuo Basho, or the much earlier 11th century Ise Monogatari, the Tales of Ise, that chronicle in prose and poetry the wandering of an exiled courtier. And of that work, many illustrated versions, both painted and printed, were made during the Edo period, during the centuries preceding the journals. More relevant here, though, I feel, are popular mass market printed volumes, such as the collected sites of Setsu province seen here, published in 1796. These are publications that reflect an explosive growth in internal travel during the mid to late 18th century, tourism, if you will. And they often feature panoramic views with captions, not unlike those in the journals. And as we'll see later on, elite depictions of the goings-on of ordinary folk are a leitmotif of the journals, prefigured here by a trend seen in an earlier image like this vignette of a group of pilgrims from a famous illustrated book, picked, I must admit, somewhat at random. And we see still more of this in the famous landscape prints of the 1830s. Hokusai is one, and even more those of Hiroshige, where striking views are often offset by sympathetic depictions of the passing everyday domestic moment. At a more elevated level, there's this extensive pictorial diary compiled by a leading painter, Suzuki Kietsu, in 1833. Much more subtle in its nuanced brushwork than the semi-amateur journals, but sharing its combination of landscapes with studies of local people. In this case, the Oharame, women from the town of Ohara, now part of Kyoto, who were renowned for their ability to carry heavy loads of firewood on their heads. And like the journals, Kietsu's account is captioned in a combination of Chinese characters at the left there, for identification of sites, and Japanese commentary at the right, the Japanese language often for commentary at the right. But I think we can and should look a little bit further. The Japan diary of Colin McVean, who we mentioned earlier, we're going to hear more about at the end, contains this shipboard scene, which reminded me instantly of something from the beginning of the Kisogawa journal, which I haven't yet shown you, going back a little bit here. I'm not suggesting a direct influence, and I haven't had the opportunity to look at the rest of the McVean diary and judge its style and tone. But going back for a moment here to the Kisogawa journal, perhaps we see here the same constant emphasis on our activities as a group, on the sense of a small body of empowered, aloof experts with a new expertise who now are somehow taking on an othered world, the world of old Japan, and how this group rapidly adopts some colonial or imperial trappings, pith helmets, rickshaws, only just invented 3 years before, and tweed. Who knows if that tweed was from Scotland? It's quite possible. When I first started studying these paintings a few months ago, my expectation was that they'd record a joint Japanese-Western or predominantly Japanese-Scottish expedition. And it wasn't difficult for me to convince myself for a brief moment that the Western dress figures were indeed Western, until suddenly I realized that Western dress is here the uniform of the trained professional Japanese surveyor, something that is discarded after work for traditional attire and traditional activities in traditional domestic settings. One group then, but two group personas. So now we come on to, for us, I think the most important of the journals and the most finished of the journals. It's a work of some 50 spreads with a different colored cover to the other two, obviously purchased at a different time. The party's destination, I just need to jump on one here, called in here in the Japanese Nasuno, and Nasu Nishibara in English, was known at least by the end of the 19th century, more often as Shiobara, and was described as follows in Murray's guidebook, always a useful place to look for current Western opinion about a place. It was written after the railway had reached there, making it a journey of only 4.5 hours from Tokyo. The place is an outcome of railway enterprise. So too is the reclamation of large sections of the moorland, which here stretch on all sides, the soil having been found well adapted to the cultivation of fruit. But we, however, are in earlier pioneering times. And While several Westerners had already made it to the great shogunal shrines of nearby Nikko, in 1875 or 1876, this was not a journey for the faint-hearted. On the left here are some of the places visited by our group on their short, compared to Kisogawa, their short but arduous journey, more or less due north of Tokyo. On the right is a map that records in red a number of preparatory journeys that have been undertaken in the previous October and November. Before we conclude with a glance through the National Journal, which is, in terms of Skaill House, by far the most important part of this presentation, we need to look at relations between Scottish, foreign, and Japanese surveyors between 1874 and 6. Even during his stay back home, McVean had received a letter from an associate in Japan, quote, giving accounts of great changes in the government offices in Japan, a strong conservative feeling in the new ministry, and appearance of ill feeling against foreigners. And after his return in May of 1874, Japanese staff were soon voicing their objections to his ambitious plans for a nationwide triangulation survey, describing him, I'm not saying they're right or wrong, as not having any knowledge or an experience of survey at all, but already praising Scharbau, who they hardly know at this point, as a very experienced engineer. Mostly former officers of the Shogun's navy and already familiar with the size and configuration of the Japanese islands from the sea, they believe themselves now well equipped for the task of surveying their own country. And as we see from the Kisogawa and Arakawa journals, had already succeeded in doing so. As Peter Kornicki in the audience today has very, very recently discovered while reading some of Orkawa's available writings on the history of surveying, he emphasizes the long history of the skill or craft in Japan before the Meiji era, and only grudgingly mentions Scharbau as the person who introduced triangulation for Japan. Orkawa's report on one of his trips makes no mention of any foreigners whatsoever. Disagreements with the Japanese authorities, which were now mostly in the formidable shape of Okubo Toshimichi, one of the founding fathers of modern Japan, rumbled on. But McVean, assisted now by Scharbau and others, greatly impressed by completing a successful observation of the transit of Venus in November 1874, and in mid-1875 he launched his triangulation survey of the Kanto region around Tokyo, working with Scharbau to select a suitable baseline for the survey project. Almost all of their early records were lost in a fire in July, but the resourceful Orkawa had made himself useful by carefully preparing drafts and copies of official documents of the Land Survey Division. In October to November, McVean, Scharbau, and their Japanese team were able to resume their task, making expeditions along the route to Nikko-Nasu. It's the route shown in the top right-hand corner of the Japanese chart in the middle here, and towards Mount Asama and Hakone, and the other ones were towards Mount Asama and Mount Fuji. So a preliminary survey of the Nikko-Nasu route, the one we're about to explore in greater detail, had been carried out 5 months earlier, from the 10th of October to the 1st of November, 1875. By the time of the March 1876 expedition, McVean's last appeal to Okubo had been refused, while Scharbau seems to have maintained good relations with the Japanese specialists, despite his enormous annual salary of 400 yen, a phenomenal sum at that time. Perhaps because it's intended for outsider inspection, this third journal is far better documented internally than the others. Not only is the year specified in this introductory paragraph, which is translated below, but the names of the expedition members are given in clear detail, with Orkawa's name coming last. And it's thrilling to know that we discovered only this morning a document, a separate document, a receipt signed by Orkawa, which is in precisely that same distinctive calligraphy from his name. Japanese readers will be able to see it in the 6th column from the left near the bottom. So we know this particular paragraph, at least, is without a doubt in Orkawa's own hand. And the date of departure, I think, is perhaps significant, coming just a few weeks before McVean would finally leave Japan on the 10th of April. We've met 2 members of the group already, but of the others, Sekino Shuzo is recorded as having taken part in a later surveying expedition in 1886. And I also discovered only yesterday that in April 76, during the Nasu exhibition, Sekino signed and sealed, along with Orkawa, an acknowledgement of a payment from Scharbau for 100 yen. We're not quite sure what the nature of that payment was. This invoice is preserved at Skaill House, tucked into the back of Scharbau's own diary. And as an indicator of Sekino's westernizing bent, it's nice to note, I can't show it, but his little Hanko official seal is not in Japanese, but bears the letter S twice to indicate his Western initials. And the last of these individuals we know is employed as, Morishima was employed as a surveyor from 1873. Ito remains a mystery, but these clearly are going to be the surveyors of the next generation. Now, another discovery made only today, just a few hours ago. I was about to say we don't know who brushed this rather elegant inscription on the right, which is in what is known in Japanese as reisho, often translated as clerical hand. But to my great delight, I came across an article where it is mentioned, quite out of the blue and out of context, that Okawa had a particularly good reisho hand. So it's not 100% certain, but one can hardly doubt this was written by him. And its inclusion speaks, I think, to a determination to present this last journal as a refined quality production, something for the ages, or at least something for possible enjoyable perusal by a superior, in contrast perhaps to its more hastily prepared predecessors. And there are similar reisho inscriptions interspersed throughout the text. Now here we see, I'm not going to read out what it says at the bottom of each slide because it's an aspect of presentations I find very annoying. There it is for you to read. Here they gather, and obviously once again the figure on the left, slightly detached, maybe arriving after the others who made sure to be there before him. This is Mr. Shinohara, who's going to advise them and help them. And Senju, located in northeastern central Tokyo, is the first staging post or station, not a railway station, but a staging post on the Oshu-Kaido Road, an official route which runs from Senju in Tokyo and well beyond Otawara to the north, all the way along the route our friends are going to take. Now let's go on a journey with them. Off we go. At noon on the first day, they stop for lunch at Soka. And it seems that same day they make 32 kilometers, what's that, 25 miles. They get to Sate Station in Saitama Prefecture. So they're making pretty quick progress, I would guess by rickshaw, although not shown. And so begins a familiar, although maybe in this volume, I think a little bit more fastidious and a little bit less characterful documentation of eating, drinking, and sightseeing, just as much as of the hard business of surveying. But contributing to a sense of artifice, a little bit to a sense of artifice, while Koga is another 13 kilometers on, that's 9 miles from Sate, Utsunomiya, which they claim to have got to on the left, is a further 47 kilometers along the route, 30 miles or so could not have been reached on that day. While Koga might have, in fact, have been a better location for viewing the two provinces, as they say, as it said in the inscription. So there is some artifice here, maybe some carelessness, maybe some misremembered events that were actually set down some days after they actually took place. Who can say? Here we come to one of a number of very meticulously detailed incidents that take place on the route. This one is about, it's about the encounter with local dialect and the misunderstanding of local people. I mean, just very briefly, they ask her to call the master, and she comes back instead with cups of sake because the word sounds almost the same in the local dialect. Humor ensues. So the next morning they get up and leave the inn and they continue on their way to Nasuno. Here we see them cutting some of the things, some of the materials they need, the posts and other markers that they need for their surveying work. And then we get to an interesting stop at the thatched hut on the slopes of Mount Karasumori, where they come across a randy female cat and write in some detail about her. And I want to say, perhaps it's worth repeating, that all of this is in Chinese, very much reflecting the educated background of these young men. It's in good, classical, easy to read, for me, Chinese. Now the party pushes on, as always. Meals are recorded. Anything Western that enters into their site is often specifically mentioned, and there's a good deal of depiction of the scientific process of carrying out a survey. And then they reach the Nasuno plain, which is flat and therefore ideal for the triangulation of the clearly visible peaks in the distance, something that Scharbau himself also comments on. and provides the baseline for surveying, which might have been established during the previous autumn's preparatory expedition. Here the group feel a little bit sorry for themselves, a typical view of our room in every inn where we stay, clothes scattered everywhere. Blustery winds from the snowy mountains chill us to the bone. We shelter from the wind with the sun directly overhead. The thing is given a personal and a kind of poetic tone. Then the expedition's works begin in earnest. We see theodolite for the very first time, but also we see this observation of the passing humans, the local people. An old man with a load of venison and the village women leading the horse. Running on again, their own experiences, they get thirsty, they set up their theodolite, they demonstrate that they're working hard, that they're doing what they came to do as well as having a fun time. And there's a great deal about the weather. They get caught often in the weather, and then an experience familiar to all of us, they spend all day working from home. Amusing themselves with arm wrestling contests, trying out new methods of surveying. Here they're using a surveyor's chain, and occasionally observing aspects of the passing season, so important in appreciation of the Japanese countryside, and sometimes adding in red ink an occasional poem in Japanese. So we continue on with this alternation of recreation and hard conscientious graft. And as a further sign of the, what can you say, tentative nature of some of the what's depicted here, someone's actually dived in and corrected a mistake. Someone's made the mistake of suggesting that they'd seen Mount Fuji. Of course, it's not Mount Fuji. They're an awfully long way from Mount Fuji, and they're looking in the wrong direction. They're moving towards the north. So it's a different peak, and someone's pointed that out. So this adds to my feeling that maybe illustrations and inscriptions are added at different dates, subsequent to the event, maybe, and that mistakes are made as they go along. Another poem, this time on the Hazy Moon, or Worozuki. And here we have another intrusion of Western goods and drink, which gives us an opportunity to find something parallel that Henry Scharbau experienced when he made 2 trips to this region in the previous year. It contains some very good shops, champagne and ale for sale. It is marvelous how quickly civilization spreads. But our friends are keener on some of the more traditional means of relaxation, and here they hire a blind masseur to soothe away the day's aches and pains. There's a lot about food. They feast on 3 chickens. They take this distance survey view, which I wanted to show you, because we also have Scharbau's survey view, recently identified, I think taken from the other side of that mountain range, not necessarily the same year, but nice evidence that they're both in the same region, if not at the same time. Another more depiction of the scientific process, but also here another depiction of something that happens 3 or 4 times in the journal, the eating contest. I've been on a soba eating contest myself in Japan a long time ago, so I know this really does happen. The rain makes itself heard. Looking out of the windows, we long for home. There's quite a lot of feeling sorry for themselves. But then we have this, hang on. Here we have this glorious view of cherry blossom. We're here with a poem added, and more soba eating goes on. Then we continue to we're getting quite near to Otawara Castle at the end of their journey. They look at the ruins of the north bank of the river, and here we have this kind of panoramic bird's eye view, which is something that's greatly favored by the artists of these journals. And finally, this quite elaborate view of the Orkney River, described in Murray's guidebook some 25 years later. Shortly after Sekiya, we enter the highly picturesque valley of the Orkney River, with lofty and densely wooded hills on either side. At various points, glorious views are afforded of the water rushing over its boulder-strewn bed. So our friend Mr. Shinohara, perhaps not so firm on his feet as the others, has an accident, but the party gets on with the task of collating its results. But now, drum roll. Henry Scharbau appears. There he is. Mr. Scharbau arrives at Ottawa Station, and our whole group sets out to shake him by the hand. Scharbau, in his own diary, describes the exact same incident. We know that it's him, because his name is written up there. The characters read Shiapo in Japanese, but as often with Meiji period inscriptions of Western names in the early Meiji era, the Chinese pronunciation will take you nearer to the pronunciation of the Japanese. Xiaobao. Xiaobao sounds quite like Scharbau, isn't it? The interesting thing is that Scharbau is only interested in, who I think is traveling by rickshaw for reasons we will come on to in a moment, seems only interested in the landscape and not so much in the human environment in which he finds himself. We know from his own journal that he'd been in the area from the 23rd of April, and we even have a receipt for advance payment of rickshaw fees, again only just discovered yesterday, dated April 26 and made out to Mr. Scharbau for 10 yen for his journey all the way from Tokyo to Ottawa to this point. Still, going back to Scharbau for a moment, he does seem to have appreciated his 2 visits to nearby Nikko and the surroundings. As he wrote, the scenery here is really beautiful. And the Japanese seem to have a keen appreciation of the beauty of their country. They draw attention to every picturesque spot by raising there a temple, chapel, torii, tea house, pavilion, or some kind of resting place. And the traveler is frequently invited to stop on the road and refresh himself and enjoy the beautiful landscape, quite forgetting the tolls of the road. And despite Orkawa's history of skepticism about the value of Scharbau's contribution, here there seems to be more than a moment of warmth. Warm feelings of strong affection between East and West. And Mr. Scharbau goes for a walk with Shinohara. Why is he leading Shinohara? Do they have an existing friendship? We have no idea. It will be fascinating to find out. So Scharbau's arrival triggers a scheduled return to Japan. And note here that the Magamochi or chest is now inscribed Shiribyo, Geographical Bureau, reflecting bureaucratic changes that had taken place late in 1874. They get back to Utsunomiya, where Scharbau's journey from both of his accounts from that year and the year before tally beautifully, and particularly where he mentions my appearance here creates great astonishment for I have a crowd of people looking at me. And here we have him commenting more on the unfavorable weather than on the beauty of the scenery, something he likes to do. But here I feel he looks a lot happier. And it's interesting to see that he records of his previous journey that he's doing the same thing here. I'm living in a truly Eastern style. I take my meals on the floor in Western fashions like the neighbor and keep my legs crossed like a sultan. I wonder how they communicated, but Orkawa likely had more than a smattering of English. As Scharbau himself observed, in the Naval College, Engineering College, and College of Chemical Technology, the pupils are taught the English language and receive their instruction from English naval officers and masters. As for briefly Orkawa's later career after their return, he entered the Geographical Division and made a career championing accurate map making throughout the country. He was also a member of an important group called the Yoyosha, the Boundless Society, a group of Meiji-era scholars, officials, and intellectuals, mostly samurai with a Confucian education, and belonging to the moderate nationalist faction, whose interests ranged from German philosophical idealism to French literature to Asian history. Orkawa would go on to write or edit books about maps, conversational Korean, and weights and measures, and in September 1893, he quit all his public offices and opened the publishing house Seikado in Tokyo's Kando district, specializing in maps. He died 4 years later. We need to know more about him. Now I want to say a quick word about hats. One of the striking scenes in the Kisogawa journals is which I can't show you now, is where the party throws sweets into a river and watch the village boys competing to get hold of them. It's really quite not a very respectful attitude towards their countrymen. You get a sense of the same thing, I feel, where someone, I guess Orkawa in the center here, is wearing a pith helmet and delivering orders. It looks very like a picture of someone in India, perhaps in the pith helmet, delivering order, or an Englishman in India in the pith helmet, delivering orders to Indian people. And if you look at the top left, I think we see in the evening, not just the pith helmet, but the special pith helmet case that he kept it in. So it's obviously an important piece of headgear. And Mr. Shinohara, on the other hand, at top right, has a different kind of hat, one which is more liable to blow away. It's not a pith helmet. Now, why is all this important? Because as the more observant of you will have noticed, throughout this last journal, most of the Japanese, all the time, are not just wearing Western dress during the day, they're also wearing Scottish tam o' shanters. And it's all but certain that McVean had given them these on his departure from Japan. When they got back from their trip, they carried out a sort of reenactment, I think you could say, at Scharbau's home in Tokyo. Here you can see Scharbau in the bowler hat. You can see Okawa, who is said to be the figure sitting down at the left, another figure in a tam o' shanter at the right, and a rather disgruntled looking coolie at far right. So this whole experience with the tam o' shanter was reenacted. And I would venture to suggest that on an occasion like this, in September of that year, that perhaps the journal was presented by Okawa to Scharbau. What about the two previous journals that are not related? Well, maybe he had them and said, well, you might as well have these as well. It's hard to say why those were given to Scharbau, which is, of course, the reason why they're now in Skaill House. And here we have Colin McVean, of whom we're going to hear very, very soon. But at this point, I'd just like to sum up very, very quickly. The tone of these journals, with their lively illustrations and informative inscriptions, sometimes in Japanese, but often in Chinese, suggests a group of clever, confident young men with a high level of traditional Confucian education, guided by an elder mentor, proud of their very recent history of the new Western science of triangulation. They set off for relatively remote parts of the country, determined to experience rural and regional life to the full and have a good time while diligently carrying out their official duties. They dress in professional Western attire during the day, but switch to traditional Japanese clothing in the evenings, or on the many days when bad weather forces them to work from home in their inn. Representatives, like the Skaill journals they created, of an extraordinary transitional epoch in Japanese history, they struggle to reconcile their admiration for Western enlightened science and technology, personified by their Dutch and Scottish mentors, with their desire to set their country on an independent course. It would be fascinating to know what Scharbau himself really thought about them and about these journals. Thank you. Now I'm going to hand over to Colin.
Great. Thank you very much, Joe. That was absolutely fascinating. Although I spent some time today having a look at those, I haven't benefited from the interpretation, which is just stunning. So thank you very much for that. It really brings it to life. And thank you to Skaill House for inviting me here, and to Pier House for the venue, and also to the Orkney Japan Association as well for their help. It's really lovely to be together for this collaboration. I'm just going to give you the main talk tonight about Scharbau, so I'm just going to give you a quick sort of whistle-stop tour about McVean and how he linked with Henry Scharbau just through the presentation just now. So having a look at basically McVean started, he was a civil engineer in 1860. He worked with the Hydrographic Survey on the west coast of Scotland. There he met Scharbau and worked with him for some time, and they became firm friends. He then headed off in 1866 to Bulgaria to work, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, on the Varna to Rostock Railway. And in 1868, he got married to Mary Wood Cowan, and he headed off to Japan to work on the supervision of the erection of lighthouses in Japan. Now, this was for the Tokugawa shogunate. This was pre-Meiji restoration. But by the time he got there, the Meiji restoration was in full swing, so he had to renegotiate his contract. In 1869, he fell out with the person who was working there, Richard Henry Brunton, and he worked with the Vulcan foundry, making items for the new railway, which was going to be built from Yokohama to Shimbashi Station. And in 1870, the Japanese government formed the Ministry of Public Works. Now, with a chance meeting, he met Yozo Yamao, who was one of the Chosu Five, who had been in Scotland, who came out with the help of Thomas Blake Glover in 1863. And Yozo Yamao worked with the shipyards, learning engineering in Glasgow. So when McVean met him, he was met by a Japanese individual who spoke impeccable English, or should I say Scottish, with a very strong Glasgow accent. So they got on very well. There was obviously some common links there, and they got on well. And through various other meetings, Yozo Yamao then appointed him to the head of the survey department in 1871. Now, he lived originally in Yokohama, but this is him. He moved up nearer to the Ministry of Public Works and to the Imperial Palace. And here he is with his tam o'shanter in the middle there again, with his wife Mary and son and daughter Helen and Dondo, and the Japanese staff there, including his bodyguards as well, which he had. And he had these guards whenever he went out on his missions. So one of his first tasks there was to build the Imperial College of Engineering, which is there in the top left. It was the architect was a person called Joyner, and McVean helped with the construction and supervision of that. So this is very much the first building blocks so that the Japanese could have their own teacher training, or their training college for the surveyors. Now, the top right on the map, the top right section there, you will see the far right-hand side. That is the Imperial College of Engineering, phase 1, along with a accommodation block and teaching block for the students, of which it was estimated that there would be over 200 surveying and engineering students would be there as a priority. So obviously, if we come further down on that, we will, on that map, you will see that that's the college, and then you've got the Ministry of Public Works just below that. And then further down, we come down to where they actually stayed within that, which is Yamato Yashiki. And there you'll see McVean's residence in the bottom left. Now, there were 9 houses there, all for the surveyors and engineers working for the Ministry of Public Works. They did not live in the British legations of Yokohama or in Tokyo. They had their own special quarters, and we need to find out if Scharbau actually was there or Yokohama, and it wouldn't surprise me if he was there. It was known as Little England locally, and living there was very interesting because they were not generally going out to Western hotels. They were going to Japanese hotels, Japanese restaurants. They had a very good social life with the Japanese. Mary McVean was very good friends with Mrs. Yamao and Mrs. Ito, and they very often were together. The ladies were together looking after the children, or just spending time together and learning the languages. In 1872, there was a great fire in Ginza, and that was a picture of Ginza being redeveloped in 1872 under the supervision of McVean. So looking at the survey department, this is at the Yamato Yoshiki, and that's McVean's residence top left there, and McVean is on the right-hand side there, and Yozo Yamao is next to him. But looking at what he was tasked with doing, supervising the reconstruction of Ginza, building the Imperial College of Engineering, which of course the first was headed up by Henry Dyer, again from Glasgow in 1873. Also given the task of the first national triangulation surveys, as we heard, and also appointing Henry Scharbau. Now, from that, as well as Joe was saying, he came home. He wanted to come home, and he came home in 1873, tasked with recruiting the engineers. So he recruited Scharbau and a person called Cheeseman, who also worked with hydrographic surveys, and also Klassen and Stewart and MacArthur. So he chose particularly Scottish engineers or people he had worked with in Scotland to be part of the team. He also introduced the first seismographs because seeing what the situation was like with earthquakes, he instructed Scharbau to visit Palmieri on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, and Palmieri built his new version of the seismograph, which was absolutely top of the range. And that was then brought to Japan in ready in 1873, but 1874, Henry Scharbau brought them over along with new theodolites and equipment for the survey department. He wanted to get on with that, but suddenly Emperor Meiji said he's moving from Kyoto to Tokyo. And the Imperial Palace, whilst it was just above the Ministry of Public Works, was in a state of disrepair, having not been lived in for many, many years. So one of the first tasks was to survey that and redevelop that for the emperor. And then going on, as we heard, to do the detailed surveys around the outskirts of Tokyo. As mentioned, the transit of Venus in 1874. This is a very interesting picture, and I hope you can all see that. We can see quite clearly who many of the people are within this section. But the Ministry of Public Works came under the Home Office in 1873. As we heard, there was a bit of, well, McVean was away, there was a bit of a changeover. So some of the previous Tokugawa shogunate were back, and very conservative views about Westerners working there. And this is actually split. The left-hand side front four people there are from the new Home Office, and they are from the Tokugawa, the shogunate side. And on the right-hand side there, we have the, so on the right-hand side, we have the Prime Minister there, and sorry, just trying to get that. But we have, just having a quick look there. Yeah, the Prime Minister, and then we have Hirobumi Ito, who was the Minister of Public Works, and then we have Murata and Murato, who both worked with the ministry there. At the back right, third from the top there, you will see McVean with his hat. But in the middle, the tall gentleman in the middle towards the back with a bowler hat, that is Henry Scharbau. And the three new theodolites were there, which worked extremely well for looking at the transit of Venus. So this was a spectacular event, and it was a tremendous success. And I think that helped McVean to sort of maintain his credibility within the department. It was a difficult time, 1874. There was starting to get some fractions there within the teams. If we have a look here, this is the survey department in 1874, and on the left, we're not 100% convinced, but I have been informed that that is Scharbau with the pith helmet. Next to him is Cheeseman. Then there's Bob Stewart on there. And then you have Murato, and then you have McVean, and then Murata, and then you have Klassen. So they're all on the front row. And I think, as Joe was saying, the order of the day was the Western styling of clothing. And you can see this, how sometimes it was mixed between the Japanese and the Western, the wonderful traditional Japanese clothing there with a bowler hat on top, which is quite strange. But then if we have a look here, if we look for Okawa, he is almost in the center, looking straight forward. You've got two gentlemen near the back row looking to the left, and just left of that, a gentleman looking straight forward with a tree behind. That is Okawa. Now, the two gentlemen looking to the left are part of what McVean termed as the anti-Western party. And they refuse to look directly into the camera. So this is the last picture of the survey department that we know of. There may be others, where some people are trying to keep their cool, but others are making a point that we don't actually need the Westerners, and I'm not going to look at the camera. Now, we know quite a lot of the names of these people. There's still some to name, and even today we were discussing, I think we've discovered the name of one of the other gentlemen within there. So this collaboration that we have in terms of us sharing these archives is quite amazing, to be able to put names to faces and faces to names. So it's quite tremendous work. And just finishing off again, as Joe was saying there, here was the tam o' shanters, the hats which we are pretty sure McVean gave to the team. And whilst he left in early 1876, and Scharbau left a bit later, and the two of them had fallen out. I think there was a case of every man for themselves, and McVean was persona non grata, and Scharbau was the new kid on the block, and he was in, but only for a few more months. So we'll have to see if the diaries kick up anything more about that. But the legacy there is McVean's bonnets, his tam o' shanters lived on whilst he came back to Scotland. So I shall just leave that there. There's so much more, but I think that's probably where I'll just leave that for just now.
So thank you very much for that, Joe and Colin. We've got a couple of questions that came in during that, so I'm just going to run through them. The first one for you, Joe. Can you place the 1873 survey in the local contemporary context? Had trigonometric surveys not previously been attempted in Japan? And did the maps resulting from the survey become publicly available? If so, when were they superseded?
Well, that's something I must confess I haven't looked into. But as far as the earlier history of surveying is concerned, the whole matter of surveying the coast of Japan, from the point of view of surveying and improving coastal defences, is something that goes back to the 18th century and involves some quite well-known artists who are known as, pure artists in their own right. I don't think actually any of that involved triangulation, but there's a great deal of Western technology floating around at a sort of kind of hidden level in 18th century Japan. It's possible triangulation may have been experimented with, but I'm not a historian of surveying, so I haven't gone into that. There are a lot, I know from the research I've done around this, there are a lot of early maps surviving, early Meiji era maps surviving in various parts of Japan, including Kisogawa. But with present restrictions, it really wasn't easy to investigate. Those are a few scraps and bits and pieces I've seen online, but you would need to go to Japan and look at these things in detail. They're not easy things to even to scan and put online. The scale of them isn't very well suited to that technology.
Thank you. For yourself, Colin, was there any contact between the leaders of triangulation surveys and those carrying out geological surveys, McVean overlaps in time with American geologist and surveyor Benjamin Smith Lyman?
I have heard of the name Lyman, but I'm not sure if there was much of of them overlapping or working together. I think I'd probably need to look into that quite a bit more. No, I think that's something for us more to delve into in a future date.
And we've got a question here from Val. I did some research on the development of mountaineering as a recreation in Meiji Japan. I would be interested to know if you have come across any references to climbing mountains for pleasure or expressions of enjoyment of mountains by any of the surveyors.
Yes. Yes, I mean, certainly Mount Fuji, Asayama, Hakone, all mentioned in McVean's diaries. And also a gentleman, J.F. Campbell, John Francis Campbell, who was the Duke of Argyll's cousin, I think, wrote a book called My Circular Notes, and it was all about his travels around the world. And McVean took him out on various hikes up various mountains. So yes, it was quite popular, maybe more so amongst the Westerners than the Japanese, but it certainly was. They were quite adventurous.
And another one followed on that, Colin. Is there much documentation of the relationship between Henry Dyer and McVean available?
The documentation on all his diaries and everything that he brought back is in the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh. So there's the extensive items there. There's also, I have a book of diaries at home, and also I have, Dyer sent McVean some of his annual journals of the Imperial College of Engineering. So I have some of those as copies from 1878, I think, and 79.
And Joe, what is the next step in the investigation of these sketchbooks, do you think?
Well, there are several things that could be done. As I mentioned, there's an extensive archive of material relating to Orkney in the town archives of Numazu, and I've seen a list of that. We've already been provided with a list of that. There are a lot of documents that look as though they may be interesting and may throw further light. But I would be very interested to know more, obviously, about the Arakawa expedition, because that's, apart from what we have in Skaill House, that's the only record existing in the world of that important expedition. That would be a great thing to find. There's a lot of material there. Another step is to go through particularly the first two narratives and to read and translate all the written material, which is harder than the material in the third volume because it's very cursively written and would be, quite a struggle to get through compared to the third volume. And another thing I would very much like to try and do would be to, not to be confined to being online, and find out who on earth this figure Shinohara is and why he's so important, and why they love him so much, and why does he hold hands with Scharbau? All a big mystery.
Yes.
And can you provide information on how scholars can access these journals online?
Well, that's maybe a matter for Skaill House, but as mentioned, there exists a complete and extremely good quality set of photographs, which is important because the volumes are now in quite a fragile condition. And I hope it may be possible over time to make those available online.
Okay, thank you both. That's all the questions we have.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's great.